noticed something fairly remarkable happened in the fall of 2008. Now, obviously, there was an economic collapse, and a lot of people lost their jobs. Wall Street was in crisis. The government got involved. But something else that was incredibly interesting happened, particularly to those of us who are interested in politics and in economics and in communicating to large numbers of people. And that was that suddenly you could interest the public in a conversation about the economy, how it works, who controls it, and who gets rich. Now, we are still in this very narrow window of opportunity where we can have the kinds of conversations that have been driven out of the mainstream American media over the course of the past 80 years or so, that have been virtually purged from the economics departments of most American universities. And the speaker we have tonight is someone who not only has a tremendous amount of academic accolades to his name, but someone who is himself an incredible communicator. And in his retirement, or his emeritus status, as they call it in academia, has dedicated himself to trying to make the world of political economic analysis accessible to people in a way they can use to produce positive social change. For 25 years, Rick Wolff taught at the economics department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which has been an oasis in the US Academy, where it has been possible to have heterodox economic views, where it has been possible to tack a label like Marxian after your name and be respected by your peers and produce academic work that is tremendously important in this country. He was one of the people who helped launch the journalism Rethinking Marxism in 1989, which has been tremendously useful to younger members of the left, such as myself, trying to ground our understanding of how the world looks in a sound theoretical basis. And he's been one of the most profound voices we found to put on the air to explain what's happening to the US economy today, not in terms of what fine adjustments we need to make to the US regulatory system to take off the edge, but in terms of how that system works, who it benefits, and why we always seem to wind up in the same place. So I want you to join me in giving a big round of applause to Rick Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff. A few notes on logistics. This man's excellent book, Capitalism Hits the Fan, is just out. It is half off the presses, and it is for sale in this building. Walden Pond Books is an independent bookseller. They are running the table to my right. Pick yourself up a copy on the way out the door. You will be supporting an independent bookstore as you do so. Everyone knows they need that support. The second piece of information, we will be taking your questions at the end of this talk. In order to submit a question, you need to get a card into the hands of Ken Preston. Ken, where are you? Raise your hands. It's that gentleman in the gray shirt back there. He'll be passing out cards. He'll be collecting your cards. My job is to collect them, to group the ones that are similar so we don't go repeating ourselves and make some kind of sense out of that so we can cover as much territory as possible. The third piece of information I have for you, the KPFA Outreach Committee is in the corner, the table under the green tablecloth. If you'd like to sign up for more information about the work KPFA does or get involved in spreading the word about KPFA, please try to make your way over there. And please join me in giving one more round of applause for Rick Wolff.
Well, thank you, first of all, KPFA, for arranging this and inviting me, and all of you for coming on a Sunday night to hear what will certainly in part be somewhat depressing news. I'm going to try to make it as palatable as possible. I can't promise you a happy ending. That's really more dependent on you than on me. But I can show you, I hope, some directions that things can take. First, let me add only to Brian's introduction something that may be of interest to you. I am a Marxist economist. I lack horns, but I am a Marxist economist. And that commitment on my part, which started many years ago in the 1960s, has, if anything, become stronger. You know, it used to be said with some criticism that Marxists have predicted 10 of the last 4 economic downturns. And that has its grain of truth, that comment. But we did suggest along the way that capitalism has a built-in tendency to collapse. And while I don't take any pleasure in it, we are in the middle, or to be more honest, in the early stages of a really big one. And the part of my talk will be designed to drive that point home. But the reason I mention the Marxism is partly to let you know that if what I'm about to do, which is try to explain how we got into this mess and why the efforts to get us out are not working, if any of that strikes you as reasonable or interesting or persuasive, I wanted you to know the theoretical framework out of which it comes. So credit is given where it's due. While that isn't popular here in the United States, that is the case with me. I do have the usual pedigrees for an American academic, and while I'm not much taken with them, I do mention them because some of you might want to imagine that one can not go through the American educational system without falling by the wayside in terms of a critical perspective. I went to school at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. Those are the only places I ever went to school. All my degrees come from these places. So I'm a poster boy for American education, and I am a Marxist. It is the sad reality that I had to develop that understanding outside of my formal schooling, because in those 3 institutions, I was never required to read one word of that critical tradition, which says very little about the critical tradition and a great deal about American higher education. Economics training in this country is a program in celebrating capitalism. It has been that way for about 40 years. It's a tragedy of the discipline. It makes it completely lopsided. And it has more than a little to do with the fact that when this great crisis hit, the people in charge, the economic advisors, had no clue what to do. That's partly because they were never required in their training, as I was never required, to understand what economic collapse capitalism produces, to go through the history of how that has happened in the past, what government programs worked and didn't. None of that was understood. They were winging it, and we are all living with the results. So let me turn then, as best I can, to an overview of what this crisis is, why it happened, why what the government is doing doesn't work, and where that leaves us. I'm not going to throw snippets at you that you have the mainstream media for. They will tell you this piece of information and that one on this day or that one, making sure it adds up to mostly confusion and, after a while, loss of interest. I'm going to try to do something different, to make it hang together, to give you an overview. And I'm going to try to do it in such a way that at key moments in my presentation, I will give you examples of how things could have happened otherwise, how alternatives exist even if our leaders make a point of not considering them. Where does it all begin? Well, on some level, it's our whole history as a nation. But you have to start somewhere, so I'm going to start in the 1970s, because something fundamental changed in the United States that most of us, and I suspect most of you, may still not have come to terms with. What do I mean? For at least 100 years before the 1970s, United States capitalism was absolutely unique. It was unique because it delivered to its workers a rising real wage. Real wage means the amount of money you get for an hour of work adjusted for the prices you have to pay. So when you make that adjustment, are you able to buy more things or not? The reality was, for 100 years before the 1970s, wages in America, the real wage, went up decade over decade. Why do I stress that? Because we're the only capitalism about whom that can be said. 100 years of rising wages, allowing the American working class a standard of living not achieved anywhere else. Why? Well, the answer is really simple. We had, for 100 years, a labor shortage. Capitalism in this country had a virtually virgin territory, given what we did to the people who were here when we arrived. And we had a very rich country, rich in resources. We had a successful capitalism that continuously didn't have enough people. And the only way to deal with that problem for employers was to raise the wages. It was the reason waves of immigrants came here, hoping for a better life than what they had where they were. And hearing what was happening in the United States, not quite believing it, they made that risky and dangerous and costly decision to uproot themselves and come here. But they did get a rising standard of living based on rising wages. The employers here not only had to raise the wage to bring folks here, but they had to keep the wages rising in order to hold on to their employees, since they could at any time run away, travel west, get land, start again. Very difficult for our employers to get around the rock bottom need to raise wages. So the rise of the United States to a big capitalist power was premised on constantly raising wages. Let me do that again. The way we became a rich, powerful capitalist country in the 100 years before the 1970s was by being unique in the history of capitalism by providing our workers with rising wages. Keep that in mind the next time a representative of the Chamber of Commerce comes to you and explains why wages really shouldn't be allowed to rise here in the United States because it would hurt our international competitiveness. It worked real well for a century. What happened in the 1970s? Again, it's pretty simple. The labor shortage stopped. Why? Several things. One, we invented a computer, which puts an awful lot of people out of work. It replaces human beings on a scale, really, we've had very few inventions that have done that. And that really took hold in our production processes in the 1970s. Number two, American corporations discovered that between the development in the rest of the world and the computer, it was now profitable to move production out of the United States on a massive scale that had never happened before. In the 70s and 80s, it was mostly manufacturing that got moved out of the country. Now it's mostly service jobs, jobs for which people have skills and have education, and we're just at the beginning of that process. India, China, and other places are where it's going. So what did we have in the 70s? We had fewer jobs needed because the computer did so much, fewer jobs needed because our corporations are moving out en masse. But we also had a very powerful social movement, the women's liberation movement in the 70s and 80s, in which millions of women decided they would no longer accept the gender division of the workplace, and they wanted in, and they moved in large numbers. So we had this extraordinary circumstance. Fewer jobs, more people looking. If you're a capitalist, even if you haven't gone to a business school, you know that if you don't have to raise wages because the labor shortage has become a labor excess, then you're stupid if you do it. American employers everywhere, starting in the 1970s, stopped raising wages. And by the way, they did that on Main Street every bit as much as they did it on Wall Street. I know it is popular to imagine that Main Street has virtue and Wall Street doesn't. But in terms of what happened in this country, they're equally wonderful or equally horrible, I'll leave that to your decision, but equal.